The gate closed behind them, and the light that once held the shape of heaven withdrew into distance. The sound of it lingered like a fading song, soft and unreachable. The air beyond the garden felt different, heavier and more uncertain, yet alive with something raw. The sky stretched wider than before, the ground less kind. Adam and Eve stood for a long time, still and small against the endless horizon. The wind moved across the plain, carrying the scent of wild grass and dust and the faint echo of what had been lost. They turned and began to walk. The earth beneath their feet was colder than Eden's soil, the grass rougher. The light that had once poured like silk now burned their eyes and skin. Each step away from the gate felt like a heartbeat torn between memory and survival. They did not speak. Words seemed too fragile to hold the weight inside them. Only their breathing filled the air, slow and deliberate, as they moved toward a world that did not yet know them. When the sun began to fall, the temperature changed. The air cooled, shadows stretched long across the ground, and the wind whispered through the tall grass like something ancient and watchful. They stopped near a small hollow where stones made a shallow circle. Adam gathered sticks that the wind had dried and brittle leaves that had already fallen. He rubbed two together, clumsy at first, patient despite the ache in his hands. Sparks caught, then flared. Fire was born. It frightened them. The flames moved like a living creature, hissing, licking the air, dancing with orange and gold light. But soon the fear gave way to wonder. Warmth reached their faces, and they leaned closer. A glow painted their skin, turning their grief into something almost holy. Eve stretched her hands toward it, fingers trembling, and whispered, "It feels like life." Adam nodded, his eyes wet. "It feels like hope." They stayed by the fire until dawn. Sleep came in pieces, broken by unfamiliar sounds and restless dreams. Wolves cried in the distance. The trees creaked. The world outside paradise was filled with noises that did not carry peace but warning. Yet even among those sounds, they sensed something that felt like a heartbeat, a presence not gone, only quiet. God was still near, though no longer walking beside them. When morning came, Adam rose and looked at the land spread out before him. It was vast, hills rising like waves frozen in motion, the color of dry gold and soft brown. "This is where we will live," he said, his voice rough but certain. Eve stood beside him and watched the wind bend the grass. "Then this is where we will begin again." They began with their hands. The earth resisted them at first. It was stubborn and heavy, filled with stones and roots. Adam worked the ground until his fingers split and bled. Eve gathered seeds from wild plants, pressing them into soil that had never been tamed. The sun burned their skin, and their bodies learned what fatigue was. Sweat became their offering. At night, they returned to the fire, muscles aching, but hearts alive with the strange comfort of purpose. Days became weeks, and weeks became months. The small field they cleared began to change. Shoots of green broke through the dirt. The first harvest was meager, but when they tasted the grain, tears came to their eyes. It was not the sweetness of Eden, but it was theirs, born of struggle and perseverance. They thanked the Maker, not with ceremony, but with quiet gratitude. Eve learned the rhythms of the land, how to tell when the soil was thirsty, when the wind carried rain, when to rest the ground. She began to hum as she worked, soft songs that rose from memory and instinct. Adam listened and joined her sometimes, his deep voice weaving beneath hers. Together they built small walls of stone to mark their garden, to keep the wild from swallowing what they had planted. When they rested, they spoke of Eden. They remembered the river that had shone like liquid glass, the trees that had whispered in the wind, the peace that had once wrapped around them like air. They spoke not to wound each other, but to keep the memory alive. Eden had been perfection, but now it was also instruction. The loss had taught them what love costs. Time stretched forward like a river with no turning. They grew leaner, stronger, weathered by sun and wind. Their love changed too. It became less like fire and more like the steady warmth of coals. They argued sometimes, sharp words rising and fading, but their anger always ended in silence, in forgiveness, in the recognition that they were each the only home the other had left. When life stirred inside Eve, it came like a surprise that felt both terrifying and holy. Her body changed, heavy with the mystery of creation reborn. Adam watched her with awe and helplessness. He built a shelter stronger than before, carried water from the stream, and stayed close. The pain came in waves that felt endless. Eve cried out, gripping Adam's hands until her nails drew blood. And then, as the sky turned golden, a new cry filled the air, sharp and living. They looked at the child in disbelief. His skin was soft, his eyes searching. The sound of his crying tore through the silence like light through darkness. Eve held him against her and whispered his name, Cain. Adam placed his hand on the tiny back and felt the small heart beating. "He is proof," he said softly, "that life still listens." Years passed. The child grew, his laughter breaking the stillness of their days. Soon another came, Abel, smaller, quieter, gentle from the start. For a time, joy returned to their home. The boys played near the river, chasing shadows and shouting into the wind. Eve would watch them from a distance, her hands resting on her knees, her heart caught between love and fear. Adam taught them to plant and build. He told them stories of Eden, of the garden where everything began, though he never spoke of the serpent or the tree. Some memories were too sharp to name. But even joy has shadows. The air of the world still carried the echo of the first choice, and its weight settled quietly into human hearts. One day, the laughter stopped. The ground that had once fed them drank the blood of their own child. Eve fell to her knees beside the earth, her hands clawing the soil that had taken what she loved. Adam stood behind her, unable to move, the world narrowing to a single unbearable silence. Grief lived with them for years after that. It crept into their mornings, followed them to the fields, sat by their fire at night. Eve's songs fell silent. Adam's shoulders bent lower each season. They spoke less, and when they did, their words came slowly, like people learning to talk again after forgetting how. Sometimes Eve would wake from dreams of Eden and reach for Adam's hand just to feel that she was not alone. But time, as it always does, moved forward. Seasons turned, the earth demanded their attention, and slowly, life returned to their hands. They began to plant again. The soil, though stained with sorrow, still responded to care. Crops grew. Animals gathered near their home. The sun rose and fell with the same calm indifference, and in its constancy they found small comfort. Years passed, and one evening, as twilight settled, Eve felt the familiar stirring inside her. At first she wept, not from joy, but from fear. The memory of loss had rooted deep. Yet as days turned to weeks, a strange peace settled over her. This life felt different, gentle in its beginning. Adam sensed it too. He spoke softly to her, his voice no longer the firm tone of a man in command, but the quiet steadiness of one who had learned humility. When the child was born, the pain came again, but this time Eve met it with acceptance. The cry that followed was smaller than Cain's, softer than Abel's, but no less powerful. Eve held the baby and felt the warmth of his body against her chest. "His name will be Seth," she said. "He is not to replace what was lost, but to remind us that life still answers death." Adam looked down at the child, his eyes full of awe and relief. "Then hope still belongs to us." Seth grew under the fading strength of his parents, a light in the dusk of their years. He was curious, kind, and gentle with his words. When he smiled, Eve said she could almost hear the garden again. Adam taught him the songs of work and the wisdom of patience. He told him of the beauty of creation, of the balance that had been broken, but could still be honored through care. The years folded into one another. Adam and Eve aged, their hair turned white, their steps slowed. The fire near their home burned smaller now, tended by Seth. They watched him move across the fields with strength and grace, and though sorrow never left them completely, they began to understand peace again. Sometimes at night, when the air was still, Adam would stand at the edge of their field and look toward the horizon where he imagined Eden still lay. He would close his eyes and listen, half expecting to hear the whisper of the river that had once sung them to sleep. He would whisper into the dark, "We remember." Eve would come to stand beside him, her hands folded, her eyes reflecting starlight. "Do you think he still walks there?" she would ask. Adam would smile, faint and sure. "Yes, and maybe he walks here too, only in ways we no longer see." Their love had become something deep and unspoken, built on endurance and forgiveness. They had lost much, but they had gained wisdom, and wisdom was a kind of light that did not fade. One evening, as the sun bled gold across the fields, they sat together outside their home. The wind moved softly through the crops, making a sound like distant laughter. Eve leaned against Adam's shoulder, her breath slow and even. The lines on their faces caught the light, and for a moment they looked almost young again. "Do you miss it still?" she asked. Adam took a long breath before answering. "Every day," he said, "but I think the garden was never only a place. It was his nearness. And though we walked away, I think he has followed us all this time." Eve smiled, a quiet tear slipping down her cheek. "Then maybe we were never truly lost." The fire before them flickered, its glow warming the dust at their feet. Above them, stars opened like slow blooms. The same constellations that had watched over Eden now watched over their exile. The night carried their words upward, small and honest. They sat until the fire burned low, the wind humming through the grass, the world breathing around them. Hope, fragile and steady, filled the air between heartbeats. The land that had once cursed them now carried the seeds of redemption. When morning came, Adam rose first. He walked to the edge of the field and touched the soil. It was dark and rich from years of work and rain. He smiled. "The earth has forgiven us," he said. Eve joined him, laying her hand on top of his. And so has he. The years that followed were quiet. The garden remained behind them, unseen yet never forgotten. The world grew, families spread across valleys and hills, and the story of humanity began to take shape. But in the beginning of every story, there was still the echo of theirs. Two hearts that broke and healed, two souls that walked out of perfection into the long work of love. When they were old and their days grew short, they sat together once more by the fire. Eve rested her head on Adam's shoulder. "Do you think our children will ever find the way back?" she asked. Adam looked into the flame, his eyes filled with peace. "One day," he said, "someone will open what we closed." Eve closed her eyes and listened to the fire crackle. The sound reminded her of leaves, of rivers, of laughter. It reminded her that even in exile, the world was still beautiful. The light faded, and the night wrapped around them like a soft cloak. The stars shimmered. The world turned. The story of exile had come to its end, but the story of brothers and the story of redemption had only just begun.